I'm very pleased and honored to be here, to be in some conversation with Eric Foner. All I can say is that, as many of you know, Eric is really among this country's greatest historians, and I don't mean just greatest living historians. And of course, it has a great deal to do with the scale and significance of his scholarship, with the way in which he has really transformed our understanding, not only of American history, but of thinking about writing and problematizing history too. But I just wanted to add, since we're at Columbia and you're all at Columbia, and Eric has spent a lot of time at Columbia, that part of what really makes Eric special is his role as a teacher and mentor. He probably has supervised more Ph.D. dissertations, at least in history, than anybody I know about. And if you would add committees that he was a committee member for dissertation, Eric has recruited students who not only just came through the traditional panel process, but non-traditional students who were already out as lawyers and activists and organizers, many of whom are now really distinguished historians in their own right. And his mentorship of undergraduates. I mean, I can't tell you how many people over the years I've met who talk about, some of them became scholars, some of them went on in law or in activism, who talk about Eric's courses as really changed the whole direction of what they wanted to do. I had a student, former student at Penn, who came here as a math major and then took one of Eric's courses, I think on American radicalism. And now he's actually a tenured faculty in the public health school here at Columbia. So he also has a incredibly widely adopted textbook. And I must say, as someone who has also written a textbook and can't get your foot in the door because they just want his books, it's kind of annoying, but it's also an indication of how wide his influences be. So I thought it might be useful since Columbia in American history has had its share of great historians. Charles Beard, Richard Hofstadter, William Leuchtenberg, who passed very recently. If you could talk a little bit about Columbia in the making of Eric Foner.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. And let me just add that Professor Hahn has also made great contributions to our understanding of American history, 19th century American history. So it's great to be able to sit and talk with him about history. And thank you all for coming. You know, history, as if you pick up today's newspaper, you will realize that the study of history, the writing of history has been absorbed into the ongoing culture wars, which we have seen for years now, dividing our society, dividing universities, et cetera. How should history be taught? President Trump just the other day said, we are demanding that teachers give us a patriotic history. We want a patriotic history. There's a sort of mythology that, quote unquote, tenured radicals have undermined the study of history by dealing with issues of race and gender and divisions within American society, rather than simply celebrating the greatness of our society, which has many great qualities also, but many features of our history are not necessarily should not necessarily be, celebrated, et cetera. And so the French historian Ernest Renan, long ago, in the late 19th century, pointed out that history is a part of nation building, is creating historical. Oh, wait a minute. This is my phone here. Let me turn it off if I can. Come on. All right. I don't know who it is, but anyway, Renan, said the history is part of nation building, and therefore much thinking about history actually revolves around mythology. that the historian, he said, a quote I used to always give to students, which got them rather puzzled, is Renan said, the historian is the enemy of the state. The historian is what does that mean? That they're traitors, they're spies, the enemy of the state? No, what he means is governments of nations build upon mythologies, on certain, visions of history, and then the historian comes along and said, well, that's not really the case at all. That's not how it was, folks. People get annoyed when historians come and destroy their myths and destroy their vision of their own society, or what it is or what it ought to be. So teaching history is challenging for that reason. It's not so much that people that students, let's say, have little knowledge of history when they finally get to college, but that one has to kind of sweep away mythologies which interfere with the right understanding or accurate understanding of history. But one of the things I've done in my career is to try to bring good history outside the academic world. I have curated museum exhibitions about one or another period of history. I have been an advisor on PBS documentaries, one that I was the chief historian on that Henry Louis Gates produced a few years ago, about the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, that has been the focus of a lot of my work, was very widely praised and won an Emmy or one of those awards they have for TV. To try to bring history outside of out to an audience that is not necessarily academic. Now, vis-a-vis Columbia, that impulse to bring history to people who are not in the academic world is something that there's always been. Or you mentioned Beard, of course, wrote best-selling works of history. Hofstadter, my mentor here at Columbia, always insisted that history is a craft that requires good writing. Don't just write in an academic. There's some little fly going on. Okay. A lot of what he taught us was writing, the craft of writing, not simply research and argumentation and things like that. Hofstadter had this mantra, which he used to tell us graduate students, 90% of writing is rewriting. Everybody should put that on their wall if they're trying to write something. It's actually a liberating thought. I tell that to students, they get, oh my God, rewriting, it's so hard to write a first draft. How am I going to, but what it means is you don't have to write a perfect first draft. As long as you know how to go back over it and think about word choice, think about organization, the craft of writing enables you to bring history to a much broader audience than might otherwise be probably. But even in terms of writing a textbook, if you go back over the successful US history textbooks, a lot of them were written by Columbia professors, partly because, well, the publishers are here in New York, so they wanted a textbook. They just call up the history department and say, well, give me an American historian. And whoever got on the phone, they said, would you like to write a textbook for Simon & Schuster or somebody, Jack Garrity, John A. Garrity, very successful textbook in the 1970s. The one I had in high school out in Long Island, Long Beach, Long Island, where I grew up, was by David Muzzy. You remember Muzzy? Probably not.
I didn't have that one.
Muzzy was a big bestseller in the 50s and 60s as a textbook, Columbia professor. Hofstadter himself was part of a textbook. In other words, many universities won't consider work like that as a scholarly contribution. You're not going to get tenure on the basis of having written a U.S. history textbook. But at Columbia, you got credit for that. I mean, it was something that was praised. It was something, and writing for a non-academic audience was considered part of your job. And, you know, Luxembourg, you mentioned, you can take Alan Brinkley, people like that who wrote very beautiful prose about our history. So I'm wandering off here, which I usually do in class. But looking back, you know, I think that in many ways, the way, you know, history was taught here at Columbia was a little different than in many other universities. And that influenced very much the way my career evolved. We should get our host here to figure out how to get rid of this fly that's going around. But if you don't mind my doing this, so anyway, I will stop right there and deal with the fly. Yes. I didn't.
Well, maybe you just should get the fly moving in this direction.
Right, you can have them.
I should say that when I was approached about doing a textbook, it was because Eric had published his single author textbook, which is unusual. And they thought, you know, this suggested that there was a real market for single author text. What I learned was his was too successful. So there was some more. Why don't we talk a little bit about the book that you're probably best known for, which is the book on Reconstruction. And let me ask you sort of about the subtitle. It's Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877. There's several things about this that really challenged the way in which historians and the American public, as little as they knew, understood about Reconstruction. One was revolution, one was unfinished, and one was, thank you for the fly. And one was starting the book in the middle of the Civil War.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you noticed that, because not everybody notices that the title is trying to say something, you know, not just give you some chronology. When I wrote that book, and actually, I will digress slightly and say my writing of that book was sort of an accident, actually. It's true that it's probably my best known work, but I didn't plan to write a history of Reconstruction. I got a call completely out of the blue one day in the mid-1970s from Richard Morris, a great scholar here of colonial American history, saying, you know, he was the editor of what's called the New American Nation series, a book on each period of American history. And he said, you know, David Donald, another good historian, was supposed to write the book on Reconstruction after the Civil War in our series, but he's dropped out. He doesn't want to do it anymore. Would you like to pick up this task? But Donald said he can't do it. I said, well, you know, Donald's a very fine historian. If he's unable to write that book, what does that mean for me? But I said, all right, I'll give it a shot. So I was, you know, it just happened that I was there to hear Morris and decide it was a worthwhile thing to do. But Reconstruction was generally defined as the end of the Civil War, that is 1865, through 1877, the Hayes-Tilden or the disputed election, which ended, at least was seen as the ending of Reconstruction. I changed the chronology a bit. Why did I start in 1863? It's because of the Emancipation Proclamation. I began by saying Reconstruction is necessary because slavery was destroyed by the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation did not by itself destroy slavery, but it was a key step in the eradication of slavery from this society. And the end of slavery means the society is going to have to be different once the war is over. That's my definition of Reconstruction, how the country tried to come to terms with the end of slavery and its consequences for everybody, not just for African Americans or slave owners. Everybody in the country is touched in some way by the institution of slavery and by the end of slavery. Then the subtitle, America's Unfinished Revolution, another accident. You know, my career is a good example of the importance of contingency. The day before it went to press, my editor calls me from Harper Columns and says, the people here think right then it was just called Reconstruction, 1863 to 77. They said, you need a subtitle. Give us a subtitle by tomorrow because it's going to press. Well, I hadn't really thought about it. I just thought it was called Reconstruction, but I just mulled it over, and somehow this unfinished revolution idea, partly because the literature was, and thanks to people like Professor Hahn and others, was now at that point emphasizing the radical changes that were being brought about in the Reconstruction period. The transition from slavery to freedom, the transition from slave labor to free labor, the rewriting of the Constitution to with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. All those things, there was a tendency on the part of some historians to say, well, those were not really that important changes. And I wanted to say, no, it was a revolutionary moment. But it was unfinished. The revolution was not completed. But that is also supposed to say we still have work to do. Reconstruction is still unfinished. The bringing of Black people in politics in a full way as equal members of the society, that's the impulse behind Reconstruction. But unfortunately, it was not permanent by any means. And I'm trying to say both, they were attempting very radical things, but after a short period of time, those efforts were reversed. So, yeah, I think if you look at the title, you'll see that there's a lot of messages, so to speak, in that title. But my main argument was that that Reconstruction is still going on, and that you can't understand society today without going back to that era after the Civil War and thinking about the changes that were put in motion and eventually were overturned and reversed.
And we know that a lot of people regard the civil rights movement as a second Reconstruction.
It's interesting. There was just an article published by Larry Glickman, who's a former student of mine, about this business of the second Reconstruction, and he calling the civil rights. Martin Luther King did this, and some others. That the effort to enact the legislation and the changes of the civil rights movement was like going back to Reconstruction. He said that as a kind of endorsement of Reconstruction, but Glickman is going through the newspapers of the 1960s found that most of the people who used that phrase they used it to condemn what was going on in the civil rights movement. The idea, which was totally mythological, but that the South was under the thumb of Black domination in Reconstruction, or that the North was vindictive toward white Southerners after the end of the Civil War, and that was a giant mistake. That Reconstruction was sort of the lowest point in the history of the United States. That's what I was taught in high school long ago. But to call something a second Reconstruction to Black activists in the civil rights movement, that was finding a historical precedent for it. But for Southern segregationists, they knew what that meant. Yeah, this is why the civil rights movement must be resisted, because it's just another example of the alleged horrors of Reconstruction.
Do you think that, the idea of the war and Reconstruction obviously being part of a connected process as a revolution has something to do with why Reconstruction has always sort of been misunderstood, denigrated, and even with the, explosion of scholarship, your own leading the way, that have at least for us, academics have transformed our thinking about it. Nonetheless, many, many people I know when I've given talks, very well-educated, college-educated people will come up and they still have this idea, well, wasn't it a mistake? Didn't they do too much too fast? Because that's what a revolution does.
Yeah. Reconstruction is, among many other things, an example of what you might call the politics of history. I'm not talking about whether the historian is a Democrat or a Republican or a liberal or a conservative or something. What I mean is how the writing of history affects the present and reflects and shows you things about the present. Going back to Columbia, of course, the original scholarly picture of Reconstruction came out of Columbia University.
Oh, right.
William A. Dunning, my predecessor here, so to speak, teaching the Civil War era, but that was over 100 years ago. He's not around anymore. Although, you know, when we hired Barbara Fields, who's a very, very fine historian in our history department, I was trying to convince her to accept the offer to come to Columbia. I took her to the Butler Library and I said, thanks to William Dunning, we have the greatest collection of books on the Civil War and Reconstruction on our Butler Library shelves. You know, this was the place the scholarly study of that era started. It went off the tracks very quickly, unfortunately. Politics of history. Every social order requires some kind of intellectual justification or underpinning, foundation. The old view of Reconstruction as a terrible mistake, as oppressive to the white South, that the granting of rights to Black people somehow took things away from whites. You hear that today coming out of the White House right now, that, you know, diversity is bad for white people. It's bad for standards, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I'm talking about here. But, you know, so the historical view of Reconstruction was a legitimation of the social order of the Jim Crow South. It was, how can we explain that the 3 amendments to the Constitution were essentially abrogated by the Supreme Court in the 1880s, 1890s, and into the early 20th century? How can we explain that the Ku Klux Klan and groups like that, using terrorist violence, assaulted and overthrew the biracial governments that were established in the South? How can we explain that Black people lost the rights that they had been granted in Reconstruction? Well, you could say it's unfortunate, or it was a terrible mistake, or you could say, look, Black people were given the chance and they blew it, right? These were oppressive regimes. They spent too much money. They were, you know, all this kind of thing. And therefore, Reconstruction, it's good that Reconstruction was actually overthrown. Yes, maybe they went a little too far, the Klan, you know, some of those massacres, a little much, but Reconstruction was a bad mistake. And that, as long as the segregated South existed, that view of Reconstruction was not going to be challenged. When you get to the 1940s, let's say Gunnar Myrdal's book, The American Dilemma on Race in America, very pivotal book in the rising consciousness of the evils of segregation. Myrdal, a Norwegian, or I guess, was he? Yeah, okay. He said, look, whenever I mention the oppressive condition under which Blacks live in the South, I get back, but what about the horrors of Reconstruction? And if that's where your second Reconstruction comes in, if the United States changes our racial patterns, you'll have another rerun of the so-called horrors of Reconstruction. So in a sense, you know, my book, I mean, after I said okay to Richard Morris, I began to think of how you're going to write such a thing. And I basically decided to try to destroy the Dunning School, basically, not you know, to show that it lacked actual historical foundation. It was, in fact, as I went along, I discovered that those Dunning scholars, most of them his graduate students here at Columbia, really weren't very good historians. They didn't use any sources from Black people whatsoever. You had 4 million former slaves. They were part of the Reconstruction, story themselves, but they completely dismissed documents coming out
Well,
of
one
Black
of the things you
communities.
did was really center African Americans as enslaved and as freed people in terms of their own, organizing economically and politically, centered it in Reconstruction.
Right. Well, that the former slaves were the key actors in Reconstruction. Was my argument. Not that they got everything they wanted. In fact, they didn't, but they helped. Their demands for equality helped to set the national agenda in Reconstruction and opened up these questions of constitutional change and political change and economic change, which didn't go as far as the political did. But that's why it took me a long time to write that book, about 12 years from when Morris called me, because I really wanted to make it. Now, no book is ever definitive and no book is ever complete and never to be challenged, but I wanted to do as much as I could to really, because in the wake of the civil rights movement, we needed a different view of Reconstruction. The old Dunning School view was simply not appropriate for a country which had passed the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and in which there had been a great mass movement to overturn the segregation system. So I'm very gratified that the book was very successful and is still maybe the book people turn to if they want a history of Reconstruction.
It's the major statement on Reconstruction. I mean, you start there and then you think, well, we still need to learn about this and that. And then you realize, well, actually, Eric did talk about that. So it's slightly depressing for people who want to go ahead. But I will say that another thing about the book is that Reconstruction was generally seen as something that was happening in the South. And I think your book tried to see this as really a national, and some of your other writing as kind of an international experience.
Yeah, now it is true. My former student, Manisha Sinha, has just published a very important book on, she also changed the chronology by taking Reconstruction all the way up to 1920. She developed a very interesting idea that the Women's Rights Amendment, the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was the last constitutional amendment of Reconstruction. Why? Because she sees Reconstruction as an effort toward equality. And so the Women's Suffrage Amendment is a logical outcome. Even though a lot of the feminist activists at that time could not escape the racism that was dominant in American society in many ways. Nonetheless, the idea of a constitutional amendment to promote the rights of women was a legacy of Reconstruction. That's our argument. In other words, there are still people thinking in new, different ways, which is great. The more, the more the better, especially when they're my students. Because they're going to say some nice things about,
It's about destroying your...
Right, yes, I know. That's often done.
Woodward called it gerontophony or something like that, the devouring of one's mentors. Right. I have many questions, but I thought it might be a good opportunity for questions from you. If there aren't, I can ask Eric some more questions.
My name is Fiore Sorecci, and really more a notion that came to me as you were speaking. Speaking of comparing historical approaches and good writers, I assign many good writers from the Columbia tradition to my students, including you primarily. One thing that came to mind was to compare the models of Reconstruction and where you see the differences. So when you talked about your book on Reconstruction, I use an earlier book of yours called Liberty, or Give Me Liberty, I think it's called, from 1963. Easier to assign. But I kept thinking of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and his model has certain features that are quite beautiful: ethnography, lyrical writing, things like that. He also poses the Reconstruction as a kind of elegiac tragedy in a way, as part of his beautiful writing. And also newer models of looking at Reconstruction and the history of Jim Crow and race relations, where moving away from color blindness. But the question, to be more succinct, is what points do you compare your model with, especially Du Bois's model, or any other model you can think of? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that question, because actually, first of all, I grew up in a sort of left-wing family. Of my parents was, I guess, products of the 30s, the Depression. They had followed many other people into the sort of radical world of New York City at that time. Du Bois was a friend of my family. Paul Robeson was a friend of my family, the sort of left-wing black radical activists. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which had little impact in the mainstream academic world when it was published in 1937, I think, but has since become foundational for thinking about Reconstruction. And my book was influenced greatly by Du Bois. The key arguments of Du Bois are ones that I reinforced. That is that Black people, why is it called Black Reconstruction? Because Black people, again, were centers of the important events and demands. The international importance, that he sees Reconstruction as a pivotal moment in the history of American democracy.
Yeah, right.
And the overthrow of Reconstruction was a tragic result for the whole world. It set back the cause of democracy throughout the world. Now, Du Bois is putting American Reconstruction in the context of European empire and other anti-democratic, aspects of 20th century history. Now, I'm not sure what you mean by a model. I was, as I say, strongly influenced by Du Bois. I think I added a lot to Du Bois in that I was able to, in the 1970s and 80s, I was able to rent a car for the summer and just drive around the South from archive to archive and library to library, doing the kind of in-depth research which Du Bois was not able to do in the 1930s. First of all, he was getting on in age at that point. I mean, he lived into his 90s. And second of all, a Black guy driving around to archives may have not been welcome in some parts of the segregated South, right? So in a sense, Du Bois set forward a model of Reconstruction, and it's not like I started out knowing what I wanted to find, but he gave me pointers as my, things to look for. Du Bois was the first really to emphasize the land issue in Reconstruction. Today, if you ask students or others, why did Reconstruction fail? They're likely to say, well, because of 40 acres and a mule. That is, failure of 40 acres and a mule. They didn't distribute land to the former slaves. They left them in a condition of poverty and, lack of economic resources, et cetera. Or you might say the political revolution went forward. The economic revolution didn't go nearly as far as perhaps it should have, but Du Bois was the one who put that on the table as a historical question. What can I say except that my book was powerfully influenced also just by an explosion of work on Black American history in the 1960s and 70s, coming out of the civil rights movement. Here's a fact about me that you may not know. I was finishing my Ph.D. I taught the first course on Black history ever taught at Columbia University in the spring of 1969. Black student, there had not been any Black students, frankly, as an undergraduate. I was an undergraduate here in the early 60s. There were 2 Black students in my class of 700. There were 2 Black faculty in the arts and sciences. I've tenured faculty. One was Charles Hamilton in political science, and one was Elliot Skinner in anthropology. This was a segregated university. People don't realize they didn't want Black people around Columbia, honestly. Otherwise, how do you get a class of 700 with 2 Black students in it? that was the nature of American society. And it wasn't, you know, as you said, it wasn't just the South where these exclusions were taking place. But anyway, as a result of all the things going on, students were demanding a Black history course. And the chairman of the history department asked me if I could teach it. And I said, yeah, I didn't know what I was getting myself into. This was the height of Black power. And there were now 40 or 50 African-American students, not just 2 in the entering class. And they wanted a Black professor, which I can hardly blame them for. On the other hand, I had a job to teach. That was my job. I had to teach. It was a real trial by fire. Somewhere into the term, the students started demonstrating against the course. They wanted a Black professor, although privately they told me they liked my lectures. And, you know, it was nothing personal. To be called a racist insult. No, it's not. Well, it was personal to me. It may not be personal. But anyway, I taught that course. The result of that was nothing that ever happened in a classroom after 1969 could faze me. It was really quite an experience. But nonetheless, to me, it's also just a picture of what the establishment academic world looked like. You know, now today we have Black professors and all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds as professors. We have a very diverse student body at Columbia, although the Trump administration is trying to get rid of that, it appears. And you know, but that was part of my growing up as a teacher. And you know, it wasn't easy, but I did learn a lot about teaching and dealing with a classroom where there's a kind of a chaos going on sometimes. I'm not sure where I started with this, but I'm going to stop right there. But that was part of my experience here.
So it's not exactly what you were brought here to talk about, but it's impossible at this moment in time in America not to ask you as historians how your background as historians helps you to understand the quite terrible times we're going through.
Well, you know, this is where we get back to the politics of history and sort of understand and Renan, what are the foundations of national consciousness, so to speak? And we also go back to Professor Hahn here because he has written on Illiberal America, right? That's the title. A very fine book called Illiberal America, which helps to explain where we are today. It's about, you know, it's very easy for us as scholars to deal with what Lewis Hartz in a very famous book back in the 1950s called the liberal tradition in America. That was when Lionel Trilling, one of the most famous figures in Columbia history, wrote in a little essay, I think in Partisan Review, basically there's no tradition, there's no ideas in America except liberal ideas. There's one set of, this is the so-called consensus school, my mentor Hofstadter was part of it, that really America has not given birth to different political traditions. There's just liberalism. Liberalism not meaning what it does right now, but more like 19th century liberalism of individual rights and economic free trade and things like that. But Professor Hahn and other scholars have shown that that's a very limited view of America's political history and political intellectual history, that there are these strands throughout American history of authoritarianism, of illiberal outlook, of racism, of nativism. It's a depressing book, you know, Steve. I mean, people read, oh my God, how did we get this? No, but this is part of the American
It's very hard to
tradition.
write a conclusion to.
Right. These ideas are out there. Where did the idea of America first come from? 1930s, right? That was the conservative Republicans, one of their rallying cries. I don't need to say that racism is deeply embedded or has been in American life. Nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, all these things have historical precedents. It's not like history never changes, but these are things which are floating up to the surface right now. And that doesn't mean we have to accept them as unchangeable or, that give up the fight to make this a more humane society. But I think that if you read that book, and then there are others, Alan Brinkley, again, I mentioned, Voices of Protest, which talked about Father Coughlin, a kind of Huey Long, Father Coughlin, and others in the 1930s. Who were putting forward similar ideas. I think history can illuminate how and why these ideas were, have flourished at various moments in American history. So history can be very illuminating if one gets away from the celebratory. What was it Nietzsche said about studying history? There's the sort of hagiography, the monuments that are put up to generals and all that. That's one way of studying history. And what was the second one? I can't remember. The third one was critical history. What Nietzsche said, the history that judges and condemns. That's what history ought to do, and judge and condemn. Now, I'm not asking us to do that in terms of how we teach. All the teaching of history is just going to judge and condemn. But that he's asking people to be honest and, forthright in how they describe the ups and downs of American history.
History also allows us to recover moments in the past that pushed against us.
Yeah, I don't mean
and
depressing.
That really made for lots of things that we feel very good about and need to remember and understand the circumstances under which they happened, when they failed, why. I mean, that's why I think the Reconstruction, story is so powerful, precisely because of its revolutionary dynamics, precisely because of what it set out. I mean, it was possible to talk about land distribution. It didn't succeed, but it was a serious discussion. It was possible to talk about birthright citizenship in the aftermath of Dred Scott. Who would have imagined in 1861 that only a few years later, the 1850s, it was the Republican Party, but it was the know-nothings, right? I mean, pushing against immigrants. Who would have imagined that you would have had a situation where African Americans constantly lost their fight? Who would have imagined that what would have come out of this was the end of slavery without compensation to slave owners? That, except for Haiti, was a new thing. Who would have imagined birthright citizenship? Who would have imagined Black enfranchisement? And I think it's important for us to recognize that these things happened. They were a product of struggles, that they were defeated but not totally lost.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I personally find the story of Reconstruction inspiring, actually, even though it's defeated, so to speak. But the fact that 4 million people, in the aftermath of one of the most brutal systems ever devised by mankind, was still able to become active agents in the processes of history. As I say, I think that's a really remarkable story. On the other hand, of course, it's depressing because as Marlon Brando or someone said in On the Wall, we could have been a contender. This was a moment. That's what Du Bois said. This was the moment where the United States had a chance to become a democracy. And we didn't. We missed the opportunity. Maybe an opportunity will come again one of these days. I don't know.
I think we have time for one more question.
May I ask a question from the audience, from Zoom?
I have to, you have to speak a
Why
little
did we
louder.
lose that moment? Why was Reconstruction?
Why did Reconstruction fail, or, all right,
Why was it over?
how many hours do you have? You know, the obstacles were great. You could, one of the funny things about studying history is that everything is inevitable after it happens. People are always looking for why Reconstruction failed, what, you know, did it go too far? Did it go not far enough, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, once events happen, the historian comes along and can create a trajectory that shows that it had to happen that way, but I don't think it necessarily did. There were always options in any historical moment. And that's another thing I think that, but, you know, some people say the failure of to distribute land left African Americans in the South and many poorer whites, who Professor Hahn wrote his first book about, you know, without the economic wherewithal, which would have made it easier for them to oppose the re-establishment of the old planter regime in the South. Or maybe this was just not a project of the 19th century. It was just too far. Who was it at the end of one of the chapters of my book? I quote a senator saying, "We have cast our anchor 100 years into the future." I thought it was a great quote, 100 years into the future. And yes, it took 100 years for the country to get back to the agenda of Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was actually a less strong, a weaker act in trying to protect civil rights than the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We couldn't, that's 98 years. We could not get back to the agenda of Reconstruction. They were trying something so different from what the American, you know, political body politic had been, that maybe inevitable, that the failure was inevitable. Maybe. I don't particularly want to necessarily go down that road, though. But
Well, Eric does have a really interesting article that came out before the book, which was on the land question.
Yes.
And which emphasizes its challenge to ideas about property rights, right? And this is something that certainly resonates in the present, because what was necessary was some kind of redistribution of wealth and power, which was going to be a problem for people outside the South. You know, what is, I think you had this thing, the New York Times said, what happens if our workers are going to start demanding, you know, the redistribution of factories in the North? Well, that went a long way to explaining what happened and what didn't.
Yeah, what didn't.
Yeah, we'll take one more question I see from the board. Sandra, Missouri, will you turn on your
Hi, yes. My question I actually also put up in the chat. Can you hear me? My question really is, I know as historians, this is an unfair question for me to ask, but what can we learn from the eventual success of restoration that we can apply to our current very challenging historical moment? What activism would work? Thank you.
You have to repeat the question for me. No, because I just, it's a little too fuzzy in my, good.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong. I think what she's asking is that what sort of activism would be important and appropriate at this particular moment, thinking in historical perspective, right?
Yeah, I'm really not sure I know the answer. Believe me, I'm not trying to avoid the question. I don't think things have. We're only 2.5 weeks into the Trump administration. It seems like it's been a lot longer than that. But I don't think the situation has crystallized to the point where it's even possible to say what steps ought to be taken. I mean, on the one hand, I'm always skeptical of throwing everything into the lap of judges. You know, I think that some of the things that have been pursued by the administration, relevant to this very much, is the effort to abrogate birthright citizenship or to eliminate that part of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Somebody needs to tell, some judge has already done this, and others will tell the president that he is not empowered to erase parts of the Constitution all by himself. Although there are people even on the Supreme Court who seem to feel that that is a possibility. So yeah, I think people ought to, we need good lawyers going to court to try to stop some of these malfeasance that's being developed in Washington. But I don't think that's enough at all. In fact, I don't like the idea, as I said, of just putting everything in the lap of the courts. But I think some sort of vocal resistance is going to be desirable and necessary. And, you know, I'm not, as I say, I don't feel that's an adequate answer at this moment, but we'll come back 6 months from now and find out what has happened, or what at that point the political situation seems to be like.
Well, you know, one of the things you can think about is that there's the so-called day-to-day resistance. I mean, how you push back against particular actions that jeopardize the lives of especially vulnerable people.
Mm-hmm.
And we can recognize that. And then there's the big question of taking account of where we are, what this historical moment is all about, and to recognize that the right has been building this for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And was on the, it was grassroots. It emerged out of that in the 60s. When we think about, you know, sort of left protests, there was a lot of right-wing activism. And so it seems to me that part of the big picture reckoning is what sort of political culture we can, you know, work to develop.